Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for your kind words, Dr. Ravichandran. Title I've given for my talk today is a bit cryptic. It's called The Art of Natural Hair Coloring. And the reason I want to talk about this is I think there is an epidemic going on and nobody talks about it. And the epidemic is actually very apparent for me to see from outside. It's not only here, it's the epidemic going on all over the world. I want to talk to you about hair dyes and some of the toxicities associated with it and what we can do to avoid some of the things that can happen with the use of hair dyes. Some of the facts with hair dyes is truly staggering. I mean, every hair dye has about 5,000 different chemicals. And if you look at it, it says here that 75% of women in the US use hair dyes. And I don't think we are we're lagging behind very much. I think it's fairly similar in India as well. At least 75 to 80% of women will use it here. And the sales are just going up. I mean, 28 billion in 2020, closer to 30 billion, I think they're projecting in the next couple of years. There was an article in the American Academy of Dermatology, and they said that about 25% of those who use it will have some form of adverse effects. It may not be very serious, it may be mild, but some form of adverse effects. And I'll be talking about a couple of them today. In the UK as well, it's very, very popular. There are both the kinds of hair dyes. Some people like to bleach it and some people like to color it darker, and both varieties. Hair dyes make up 27% of all hair cosmetics. Overall, hair dyes is a universal cosmetic. It's used everywhere, all over the world. What can it do? There are a couple of things which we are well aware of. Allergic contact dermatitis, we know occurs fairly commonly. As I said, about a quarter of them. There is a possible link with cancers, and I was looking at various meta-analysis, and the one possibility is that it may be linked with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a very mild risk, but the authors suggest that if you have a family history or a personal history of lymphoma, then you're better off trying to avoid synthetic hair dyes. So that's an interesting point which I was not aware of when I was doing the research for this topic. The other important association with cancer is if a pregnant woman uses hair dyes, then the child is more liable to get some form of internal cancer. And again, these are very slight odds, but they are definite odds ratios. The most common condition which I think is happening, which I can see quite clearly each time I see photographs of my friends together or family members together, I can pick out at least one person who has the last one, which is pigmented contact dermatitis. So that's incredibly common, and I'm not too sure whether people miss it here or just accept that it's part of using hair dyes. So I'll talk a little bit more about pigmented contact dermatitis. It's a non-eczematous variation. So you don't always get eczema before you get the pigmentation. It may be so mild that you don't experience it. There may be subtle signs, as is mentioned here. And then you get this very gray pigmentation. Sometimes it can be dark, sometimes it can be light. Generally in the lateral aspects of the forehead and the cheeks, and sometimes in the helices of the ear and in the ear lobules as well. In fact, that's supposed to be a reasonable sign to tell you that you have to look for pigmented contact dermatitis, particularly if it comes to the ear lobule. There was a nice paper in the Indian Journal of Dermatology about 2 or 3 years back where they looked at pigmentation of the ears as a possible indicator of pigmented contact dermatitis from hair dyes. These are some of the pictures. You can clearly see that the ears are pigmented. The pigmentation is more in the lateral aspect of the face rather than in the central aspect, which is what melasma does. So it is distinct from melasma, although they say that melasma is more common in those who have pigmented contact dermatitis. But you can clearly see the central face is spared. It goes more laterally in the cheeks, almost to the jawline. Also comes on the forehead, and then the ears. That's a very good clue. Usually the top of the ears and sometimes the ear lobules as well. In fact, there was a series by Bishnoi et al. They say that if you have ear pigmentation, ear lobule pigmentation, you have to rule out pigmented contact dermatitis. And you can get depigmentation as well, not just hyperpigmentation. It's a scattered pigmentation. So in fact, I've sometimes seen a sort of reticular variant of it as well. Many times it's misdiagnosed as lichen planus pigmentosus, and I don't know if people actually ask for a history of hair dyes in this group of lichen planus pigmentosus. It actually may be hair dye induced pigmented contact dermatitis and not LPP. Let's look at the mechanism as to how this could be causing it. There probably is a genetic component. It seems to be much commoner in those who have darker skin. So Asians, particularly in India, I think it's much more commonly noted. So a genetic factor meaning we have more melanin, so maybe we are more predisposed to it. There is cutaneous inflammation, and what this cutaneous inflammation does is it increases the number and the size of the melanocytes as well. They feel that some allergen, we don't know what it is. I told you there are nearly 5,000 chemicals in hair dyes. One of them possibly has an affinity for melanin, and that provokes increased melanogenesis. One thing is, people sometimes come and ask me and say, oh, I've done patch testing and it's negative. And that's often the case because the allergen is too low. It can't produce a spongiotic dermatitis. That's why you don't get eczema either. A low concentration, so you get increased pigment changes, but you don't get the eczema with it. And these cytolytic changes seems to be in the basal layer, and that's what causes the pigment incontinence going into the dermis, and that's why it's difficult to treat as well. Once the pigmentation goes into the dermis, it's very hard to displace it. What can be done? I'll be talking about natural hair dyes, but before that, I think we have to revise a little bit of the anatomy of the hair, because only if we understand how hair dyes work, then we will know how we can avoid this problem. The hair shaft is the shaft above the surface of the skin, and when you look at the hair at that site, it has three layers. It has the cuticle, which is the outermost layer, and that's like the stratum corneum of our skin. It's usually enucleated keratinocytes, and they form like a sheath, and they protect the hairs inside. You then have the cortex, which is bundles of keratin fibers. That's what gives you strength to the hair follicle. And you have a medulla right in the center. And we don't really know what the reason the medulla is. That doesn't seem to have any specific function. Most of the hair dyes, we have to look at the cuticle and the cortex. That's where they are concentrated. The hair color is usually because of melanin, which is in the hair cortex, which is the second layer. What hair dyes do is they do two things. One is, if you want lighter hair, it bleaches it. If you want darker hair, it adds in artificial pigment. So when you have a darker hair dye, it doesn't provoke your own melanin. These are actually chemicals which are put into your hair, and then they are oxidized to give you the dark color. So in both ways, the melanin is disrupted. So the existing melanin is compromised, and you are actually causing damage to the hair shaft the more often you use it. Hair dyes itself, there are three varieties. You have the temporary hair dyes, which is what I'll be talking about because they are natural hair dyes. They have to be replaced every few, maybe after every 3 or 4 washes. You have the semi-permanent ones, which last a bit longer, and you have the permanent ones, which are the ones which are most commonly used and which are marketed by various companies. The temporary hair dyes, if you go back to the anatomy, it attaches to the cuticle on the outside. And they are very weak bonds. They are called van der Waal bonds. And because they are weak, they are electrostatic bonds, which is why they remain on the surface, but after some time, they will be washed away. They don't stay on the hair for very long. The permanent dyes, on the other hand, go into the hair cortex. And the way it goes into the hair cortex is you have two chemicals. You have a chemical which disrupts the hair, and you have another chemical which oxidizes the colorless fluid to become colors. And that's why it goes into the cortex and stains it quite uniformly. And then finally you have the semi-permanent, which is probably a combination of both varieties. These are wonderful scanning electron microscopic pictures which show how the hair dye is deposited. If you look at the temporary hair dye, it's mainly on the outside. See, it's coating the hair sheath. It's not gone into the cortex. Whilst the permanent hair dyes, you can see how uniform it is, and it's completely pigmented the hair shaft, which is why it looks so natural. We have to look at the differences between permanent and the temporary hair dyes. I told you already that the temporary hair dyes, it gets washed off. So the permanent hair dyes are not removable by shampooing. It actually has to grow out. The temporary ones don't need chemical reactions, but this does. You have to oxidize it. And it is colorless usually. And then once you disrupt the cuticle and you put it into the hair, you then use hydrogen peroxide to develop the color. And that's why it's so uniform. It's a chemical reaction going on inside your hair shaft. It also bleaches, as I said, the pigment, and it oxidizes the colorless precursors. Unfortunately, the hair shaft sustains this oxidative damage, which is why the more we use it, the more disruptive it is for our hairs and the more careful we have to be. This is the mechanism by which PPD causes changes and allergic contact sensitivity. PPD, once it gets into the skin, is either acetylated or oxidated. When it is acetylated, it causes monoacetyl PPD or diacetyl PPD, and these are very potent irritants. And this is what causes skin irritation, allergic contact sensitivity. Sometimes it's even absorbed into the skin and it causes acute kidney injury and rhabdomyolysis. There are case reports of lots of hair dyes causing renal failure. So that's something we have to be aware of. It can also cause oxidation, and when PPD gets oxidated, it then starts stimulating the dendritic cells. And the dendritic cells then cause an inflammatory cascade which goes into the lymph node, and then that perpetuates the cycle of inflammatory changes. You can see that both mechanisms are not good for the skin. They both cause toxicity and they both cause inflammation of the skin. The possible solution: what can we do to avoid permanent hair dyes? Let's go for natural hair dyes. There are these natural hair dyes, and I'll talk a little bit about the first three, and there are a few more natural hair dyes. We'll look at how it can be advantages and what the disadvantages are as well. We'll talk about henna first. It's probably the most popular. It's very common in Asia, particularly in India and Pakistan. We use mehendi not only on our hair but also on our hands for marriage functions. It's from the plant Lawsonia innernis, and it's very commonly grown here. The thing is, it doesn't give you a dark color. It gives you this sort of reddish color because it's got something called naphthoquinone. That's why it can never give you the natural color which dark people with our kind of skin have. It's not that great for skin of color. There are other advantages of henna. It's supposed to strengthen and condition the hair. You can mix it with other ingredients, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail. And it stimulates hair and can treat dandruff as well. So there are some advantages of using henna. The preparation, these are all preparations which are suggested in a very good textbook on natural dyes, of which hair is one of the topics. So what they suggested is mix 1 part of henna with 2 to 3 parts of liquid, and it's preferably an acidic liquid, so lime juice or coffee which has a bit of acid so that the pH is lowered. You then make it into a yogurt-like consistency and you leave it for a few hours. If you leave it overnight, it's even better. You then divide the hair into sections and then you apply the henna. Try and make it as uniform as possible from the bottom right to the top. And then you cover it with a plastic cap, like the shower cap, and you leave it for 2 to 4 hours. You finally wash it away and you try and use a sulfate-free shampoo. In that way, there's no interaction with the henna itself. What it does give you is this sort of auburn to red-brown color. So it's not perfectly dark. It looks slightly different in our skin color, but it lasts a few weeks. Sometimes they say you may have to do a strand test, which means you take just a few strands and you try it there, make sure your skin is okay, make sure your hair is okay, and then if it's okay, you generalize it to the rest of your hair as well. The only problem with this is I've found a couple of articles which suggest that henna itself may not be that safe. So this came in 2023 and it's a big study from Korea. I think it had more than 100 patients, much more than that. And what they found was those who use henna were also likely to get pigmented contact dermatitis just by henna alone. If you look at their abstract, it says henna users had a higher risk of pigmented contact dermatitis. And look at the odds ratio, 5.5, which is fairly significant. And then it also shows that there's an increased incidence of pigmented contact dermatitis. Again, very, very high ratios. That's adjusted ratio, 4.5 to 10. So all this suggests that not just synthetic hair dyes, but maybe even some natural hair dyes can give you pigmented contact dermatitis, particularly henna, because that's what they found in this study. And this is a picture from that study of a person who had used henna. And they've specifically said, so it's a henna hair dye user, and they've specifically looked at the distribution of the pigment. And again, you can see it's the lateral aspect of the jawline, the cheeks, and the forehead. The central area is relatively spared, a little bit of pigmentation in the ear lobule, and again, the adjacent area where the hair dye may have come into contact with the skin. Another article, this is from one of the, I think this is IJT. So here, these are products available in India, and they have been advertised as henna. But when the investigator took this and analyzed it, it had PPD. So even though they say it is henna and it is natural, I'm afraid unless you make it yourself at home, it's going to be very hard to know if there's PPD here or not. Let's go to the next dye. It's indigo. Indigo is again fairly easy to acquire. It's a tropical and subtropical plant. It's a tree. And you get the dye from this species, Indigo tinctoria. It's from the leaves. And this is better because this color is probably slightly in tune with our skin. It's for darker tones. It gives you a brown or black color, and you can combine it with henna. So if you have henna, which gives a slightly reddish color, and this, which gives a darker color, together they give you a better blend. The only problem is it can be drying, so always use deep conditioning treatment after it's used. And the other thing is, if you make indigo from the powder, try and use it immediately because it cakes after some time, so you're better off using it fresh. There are other uses as well. You can use it for graying hair. Again, there's not much treatment for graying hair yet except for dyes, and you can prevent graying of hair according to some studies. It also has antifungal and antibacterial properties, and it restores hair pH. I've told you that with synthetic hair dyes, the pH is actually altered quite profoundly. Here, it actually restores it and promotes hair growth. The preparation, this is again from that textbook I mentioned. They've asked us to mix indigo powder with dark water. The proportion is 1:2:3. That is one portion of indigo with 2 to 3 parts of water. But every natural hair dye, if you mix it with something slightly acidic, lemon juice or coffee, it opens up the sheath, the outer sheath, and therefore it's able to penetrate just that little bit deeper into the skin. You make it into a smooth paste, just like the previous henna, leave it for 15 to 20 minutes, and then you mix it with henna and apply it on the hair. Usually the longer you leave it on the hair, the better it is. So even though most people say 2 to 4 hours, if you leave it overnight, put a shower cap and leave it overnight, it's even better for your hair. This is something quite recently which I found just a few weeks ago, that coffee can give you the same color. So brewed coffee can give you shades of brown, and it also gives you that multi-toned effect. And I'll show you a picture which I got from the internet recently. Here again, I told you the acidity seems to open up the hair cuticle. I've just done a video on this. You can have a look at it later if you want. You can brew the coffee 2 to 3 times the normal amount. Stronger the coffee, the more intense the color. The darker roast. In the UK, we are able to get these roasts, some of which look really dark. And I think if you get the darker roast, it will give you a richer color. You let it cool down, it will again be a bit semi-solid, that yogurty consistency. And you can add a couple of extra spoons at that point if you want an even better color. And you apply it on the damp hair. Again, coffee seems to be something which is quite easily accessible. So it is worthwhile trying these simpler things if we are faced with somebody with very, very severe contact dermatitis. You apply it just like the other natural hair dyes from the bottom of the shaft right to the ends. If you can leave it longer, it tends to work better. Finally, all the natural hair dyes, if you use a conditioner after application, it seems to stay on the hair for a bit longer. It can cause a bit of dryness and brittleness, particularly if you use it a lot, so just be careful how much you use it. What I would probably suggest to my patients is, if you want to use PPD dyes, that's fine, but maybe once every 2 or 3 times, try something natural so you're preserving your hair, particularly if you don't have anything important to do that a week or so. Try something natural, see if that helps you. Those were the pictures from the internet. I mean, if you look at it, it's reasonable color. They already have a bit of brown color, and it just gives you that darker color, and that's the sort of consistency, and that's the way to use it all over the hair. And Using a shower cap would probably be beneficial as well. Finally, hibiscus. Hibiscus is the national flower of Malaysia, I believe, and that produces a natural dark purplish or magenta color, and you mix it with other hair dyes like henna. There are quite a few other hair dyes, natural hair dyes, which I won't go into. Most of them give you that sort of golden or blonde color. So it's probably not applicable to us, except maybe for amla, which gives you a dark brown color. That's the gooseberry. Beetroot and chamomile and cassia all give you a golden color. All of them are easily accessible in our shops. This was an interesting article I found. About 10 years ago, it was published, and they mixed four different natural things. They mixed walnut bark, henna, amla, which is gooseberry, and ruby caulifloria, magister roots. And when they mixed it, they give the formula in that particular article. They actually had really good uniform coloration of the hairs. So again, if we use these combinations, we just try various combinations, we may find one which really suits our hair very well, and it may be a natural alternative to synthetic hair dyes. What's the advantages of natural hair dyes? It's renewable and natural, so you're not going to harm the environment. It's generally non-toxic, although we've seen that henna can sometimes cause pigmentation. And many of them have these natural properties: antimicrobial, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory effects. So well worth trying them just for the variety of positive things it can give you. The disadvantages is it's a bit more expensive. You'll have to do it yourself. The expense, I guess, is your time. You have to spend a lot of time making it, putting it on. So the expense, I wouldn't say necessarily is monetary. It's mainly the expense of your time which it takes. The color may not be that consistent sometimes. Unlike synthetic hair dyes, which breaks the hair, gets in, and then diffuses uniformly, here you're applying it from the outside. So you have to make sure that it's from the base right to the tip of the shaft. It can also fade more easily. I mean, sometimes within 2 or 3 shampoos, it may go back to normal, so you may have to do it more often. And the availability also may be variable. So I hope I've sort of convinced you that maybe have a little bit of a break from hair dyes at least once in a way. You can use it if you don't have problems with it, but if there are problems, try something natural, and that certainly may be worthwhile trying. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about a book which will be released this month, which I've written with my father and my son. It's called Dermatology and Skin of Color. That's a QR code. If you scan that, the cargo company will give you updates on when it will be released. So I'm hoping it will be released sometime this month. Please have a read if you can.